Peace and blessings, everyone. Welcome to Spotlight. I'm Mejuenka, and we have a very informative and important program for you this evening. We are going to be talking about cemeteries, burial, the application process, the fees, the graves, a whole host of information and regulations. I understand there is a new Burial Act, Cemeteries Act that's coming out, and the government is looking for input and to have discussions with the public about the rules and regulations, the fee structures governing burial sites, private and public, and the process by which persons get approval to have their loved one buried. I know many times we have a sudden passing of a loved one, or even the expectation that the loved one would pass, but still we fail to get the necessary information as to how the process takes place and how to go about making sure that the burial is taken care of in a legal way. And now is the time for us to get that information, so it's going to be very informative. I have with me this evening the Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Health and Social Development, Mrs. Carolyn Igwe, and we are going to be talking about fees, burial, application process, and the whole management of the burial process. So you keep it locked right here at the Spotlight. We are going to take a break for a word from our sponsors, and also you're going to be able to participate in the discussion. You're going to be able to ask questions about those things that you want to know about. We'll be right back after these words.
This program is sponsored by the law firm of J.S. Archibald & Co. and by the trust company J.S. Archibald Trust Services Limited, both of Roadtown, Tortola, BVI.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'd like to welcome Sister Carolyn Igwe from the Ministry of Health and Social Development. Welcome, my sister. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. You're looking very bright and cheerful.
Yeah, I'm in red this week because it's Public Service Week.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about that.
I'm in Team Warriors, and our color is red. Even though we're in third place, I still need to support the team.
And you need to still remain a warrior.
That's right. The Warriors fight until the end.
To the end. And this and the end of the week. The week is
the end of the week is
this Friday. Okay. So you still have a chance to catch up.
We can't win, but I think we still have a chance to come second.
You still have a chance to come second.
Yes.
So you're gonna go for it with all you have.
Yes. With all that is left in us.
Well, that's good. We got to talk about burial grounds. This is a new topic for me.
Okay.
You know, and I was wondering and looking at the documents that you sent me, why all this discussion about burial grounds? Now, I never heard of it, never had a discussion on burial grounds and cemeteries. Why? Because all of a sudden now we have to have these discussions.
It has become necessary because with effect from May 1st, 2012, the Ministry of Health and Social Development has begun the enforcement of the fee structure in the burial ground regulations. Basically, the law has been there for quite a while, but the fees have not been collected. And in the times in which we are living, the government needs to collect whatever revenue is out there to be collected. So the minister has consented that we should go ahead, and we are moving forward.
So all the time people are dying and being buried in a public cemetery, no fees. You don't have to apply to be buried. And
you apply to be buried, we process the applications, but we were not collecting the fees that the law required.
Okay. Now, how many cemeteries we have? Public, and I don't know if you know about the private ones.
Yeah, we have quite a number of private cemeteries in the territory. I think the number could be upwards of 40 throughout the territory. But Virgin Gorda, the Sister Islands, as well as Tortola. But in terms of public cemeteries, there's one on Anegada, 2 on Virgin Gorda, 1 in the Valley and 1 in North Song. We have 1 on Just Van Dyke, and we have 7 on Tortola. Cane Garden Bay, Capoons Bay, West End, Seacows Bay, Purcell or Johnson Gut, which most people are familiar with. We have 1 in Doty. People don't know about that. And then we have Greenland.
Have we added cemeteries over the years? I think Greenland Cemetery is the latest cemetery that was added based on my recollection, and I could be totally wrong.
All right. As far as I know, since the legislation was put in place, the only one I think has been added would be Doty and Seacows Bay.
Okay.
Those were added. In the legislation, it actually it mentions this and the church cemeteries as well. And there is an error that we realize that we need to correct, because it lists a Seacows Bay Methodist Church cemetery, but the Seacows Bay Methodist Church doesn't have a cemetery. The cemetery that is close to Seacows Bay Methodist Church is actually a private cemetery. That's a Forbes family cemetery. So we will seek to get that removed when the law is amended.
Okay. Now, the population has grown considerably over the years, from
1978 for the burial ground regulations and 1987 for the Cemeteries Act.
So that's quite a while, and I suspect that we've had a significant population growth. And right now we have anywhere people are beginning to say the census will come in with between 30 and 35,000 people in the territory. Are we running out of space?
Space is scarce. I don't think that we have run out of space, but I think the time has come that the government must seek to put measures in place, because in years from now, people are asking where people are going to be buried, because the Seacows Bay Cemetery was open because of the fact that the Johnson Gut Cemetery was just about full to capacity. There is space there if we choose to reopen graves, because a number of them have been there for a while. And you would find in some of the burial grounds that there are graves that can be reopened based on what is in the law, the time frame that's in the law, because a number of the burial grounds have the older graves where people were buried in graves and not in vaults. So land space is scarce, so it is something that we're going to have to make, the government will have to make a decision on at some point in time, in terms of how people will continue to be buried in the territory.
Now I'm getting this scary feeling in my mind, and my imagination is going a little wild when you talk about reopening graves. Now, do you mean that persons that have been buried for a long time, you're going to bury persons on top of those persons? Or how is that going? How is that reopening of a grave process work?
Well,
what does it mean?
Okay, well, you know, the law makes provision for adult graves to be reopened after 14 years, and children's grave, I think it's 7 years. So basically, if you look at some of the older burial grounds, you would realize that we have reused space over the years, because people were buried, a number of the spaces that people are using today, people were buried there years ago. So some of the people that dig graves, you would hear them say that when they were digging the graves, they saw bones, they found bones, because of the fact that people were buried there before. So, and then also, if you take a burial ground like Cane Garden Bay, while we talk about digging 6 feet, it's not always possible to dig 6 feet in Cane Garden Bay because the proximity of the burial ground to the sea. So sometimes you might be digging, you meet water, so they're not always able to dig 6 feet in Cane Garden Bay, as well as I think there might be a couple others as well.
So if you dig down and you find a casket, what happens?
Usually, in the olden days, I must say that people were buried in wooden caskets. So I have not heard of anybody digging after you've opened a grave I don't know how often we've opened graves, but I know that spaces have been reused. But I've heard about people meeting bones. I haven't heard about people meeting a casket as yet.
Okay, but because of the scarcity of space, it's becoming increasingly possible that we may have to reopen graves.
That's possible, yes.
Okay, and there's a specific time that we have to wait before we can reopen a grave.
That's right, 14 years, the last years for adult graves.
So the government is going to be keeping records of these graves, and so that when someone comes with the intention of reopening a grave, you will be able to look at the record and see whether you can grant permission or not. There has to be a record-keeping system.
Yes, the law makes provision for burial registers to be kept. We have had registers with all the burial ground managers, and with effect from May 1st, actually, we've also begun the process of centralizing the register, because as we looked at revising and trying to improve the system, we want to make sure, because the law actually makes provision for extracts to be made off a section of the burial ground register at some minimal cost. But we realize that if the burial records are all over the territory, it makes it a bit challenging to get, if people wanted to actually come and inspect, because based on the law, people are supposed to be able to inspect the register. So we have begun the centralization of the registers in the ministry as well, with effect from May 1st.
So when you say extract, what you're talking about?
Well, basically the information, the law also states what exactly is supposed to be there. You have information, the date of the name of the person, the deceased, next of kin. I think there might be age at death, where the person was buried. And there's actually something, we haven't been doing it, but it's something that we have to work towards in terms of having an exact location, structuring the layout and the design of the burial ground, so that if Cromwell Smith was supposed to come and say, my grandfather died in 2000, I know he was buried in Greenland, but I need to know where exactly he was buried.
You'll be able to go right to the records.
We should be able to go to the records and be able to do that. Right now, we can't do that. We have been relying over the years on the institutional memory of a number of the burial ground managers, but realizing that some of them have been dying. There are some persons who know where people are buried, but we can't continue to rely on people's memory. We must begin to address it so that there is an accurate record within the ministry, so that we can kind of direct persons accordingly.
So are we going to be numbering graves now? Or have we been numbering graves?
We have not been, but it's something that we will have to be working towards.
Okay. Now, generally, people put tombstones on the graves, and they would have a inscription on the tomb, who, you know, the name of the person and the date of birth and the time and the date of death. That would help with
that would assist the process. But there are quite a number of graves in the territory that have nothing on them.
That are unmarked.
They're unmarked. And then we have the little one that right now the funeral homes would provide a temporary marker, but those do not last. Some of them last maybe a couple months. Depends on how exposed the burial ground is to the elements of the weather. Some of them might not last very long. So you might bury somebody this month. Some burial grounds you can go and see somebody who was buried a couple of years, some of them a couple months, and it's already faded.
Yeah, I know. A dear friend of mine died a few years back, and I went to look for his grave and found that the marker was gone. And I had remembered a sort of, I had a tree as a marker, and I remembered off that tree approximately where he was, and I thought I found the grave. I can't be certain that I found the grave, but I understand how that could be from a perspective of loved ones wanting to visit, wanting to visit graves. Now, there's a whole process that you go through for burial. Perhaps you could first talk about the application process.
Okay. The application process for burials. The Ministry of Health and Social Development basically is I would say the third step in the process. If somebody dies in the territory, the hospital has to issue a notification of death. That includes information on the person, the cause of death, name, date of death, place of death.
And they issue this to who?
They issue it to the relatives.
To the relatives. Okay.
So basically, that's the first step. And of course, if it's one that requires a coroner's, requires an autopsy, that's a different process because that goes to the magistrate's court. And that is a little bit lengthier because before you get the notification of death, the coroner has to issue the cause of death, and then that will be go to the registrar's office, which is always the second step in the process. So normal death, hospital, notification of death is issued. That notification of death is taken to the civil registry and passport office. A death certificate is issued from there. That death certificate, as well as a permit to bury, are issued by the civil registry and passport office, and that is brought to the Ministry of Health and Social Development for processing of burial applications. And I might add here that recently the civil registry and passport office has been embarking on a number of service improvements, so it is now possible to apply for a birth and death certificate at both locations on Tortola. So you no longer have to apply at the civil registry office opposite Bobby's upstairs Bohem Electric. You can also apply at the passport office at the admin complex. So that is a new service, and I think people should take advantage because the notice was issued, but I'm not sure if many people know. So you can apply at the passport office as well as the civil registry office opposite Bobby's. And when they come to us, but I should say that for church cemeteries, if you're buried in a church cemetery, the process will end at the civil registry. The ministry does not process applications for church cemeteries. The ministry processes
cemeteries or private cemeteries?
Church cemeteries.
Oh.
So we have church cemeteries, private cemeteries, and public cemeteries.
Okay, so so we're gonna have to talk.
So we have church cemeteries in Methodist Church. And we have the church cemeteries in the Anglican Church in Seacoursby, Rotown, and as well as in Valley Virgin Gorda.
Okay, I'm going to get to that in a little while. Regarding the issuance of the death certificate, or the notice of death, not the certificate, the notice of death, who can ask for an autopsy?
Well, autopsies are requested in the case of these, like when we have sudden deaths, those will require an autopsy. But if it's a death where a person has been in the hospital, or it could be that the person might have died at home, but the person has been at a doctor's office within recent times, that they would know the cause of death, that the hospital can sign off on it. Those would not require an autopsy. But the others that require an autopsy, they have to go to the magistrate court.
Okay.
Like all the sudden deaths.
But if, regardless of where the person died, under what circumstances they died, if a loved one wanted to have an autopsy for whatever reason, is that a possibility, or there are criteria under which a person can and cannot ask for an autopsy?
Just for having an autopsy's sake?
I just want to know when my mother died, what she died from.
Well, the doctors can tell you that, but if it's requiring an autopsy, I'm not sure what is the criteria, but the magistrate's court will be able to speak more to that. But basically, it's strange that you're saying that, because usually you hear people say, I don't want to have anybody to cut open my loved ones and all of that kind of stuff. So basically, if people were suffering from a particular illness, it would be
you already know, so
yeah, their doctor's records. So basically the hospital can sign off on those.
Yeah, because for example, some persons might think that the loved one died because of some malpractice, and they might want to find out what the cause of death was and the reason for the death and so on. And I was just wondering how that process would work for those persons in those situations.
Okay. I'm not sure about that, but I'm sure that the magistrate's court can give them, but I don't think that you would just get an autopsy for getting an autopsy sake.
Okay, you'll have to have some presentation, and that would make sense.
I'm sure the Coroner's Act will address that in terms of when an autopsy is necessary.
Okay, we're going to take a break for a word from our sponsors, and we're going to come back and we continue the discussion about what kind of information you need to put on the application form and
Okay.
who can in fact apply for permission for burial.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Keep it locked right here to Spotlight.
Spotlight is brought to you by Bolo's High-Tech Printery, DataPro, Virgin Island Motors, and Clarence Thomas Limited.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm here with Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Health and Social Development, Mrs. Carolyn Igwe, and we're talking about burial grounds, cemeteries, processes, fees, things that you need to know. Application, we talk about the application. Who can fill out the application form, and what kind of information and documents you need to bring to get an application process for burial?
Okay, basically there are no restrictions on who can apply. I can tell you what usually happens. Usually a relative will complete the form, and what has been happening in recent years, the funeral homes, both of them, have been including that as part of their package.
Okay.
So they basically would allow the families to, they will take care of that for the families. So they will contact us, they would fax in forms if they have to drop off, collect the forms to ease the burden on families. But basically, families, individuals, relatives are usually the ones who will complete the application. In terms of the information that we need with the application, we currently require the death certificate because we need to prove that the person has died. And we also require the permit to bury from the registrar's office. Once the registrar's office issues the death certificate, there's also a form that they would issue called a permit to bury. So those are the two forms that we would have with our application. Once we process the application, we also send a copy of that application to the funeral home that's responsible. A copy of it also, of the approval, goes to the minister or the pastor who's performing the funeral, as well as the burial ground manager of the respective burial ground, whether it be public or private. I started saying about the fact that we don't process burial applications for churches, but we do process for the public burial grounds as well as the private burial grounds. Quite a number of them throughout the territory.
So if you wanted to be buried in the church, you would have to take that information to the pastor or the reverend of the church,
Right.
the official of the church, and
Right.
make provisions in the church for space and for the whole burial process.
Right.
Okay. Let me see, something I meant to ask you and I forgot. So the people come in, they fill out the application, and you issue. Now, how is it determined in what cemetery the person is buried?
Again, there's no policy on that, but usually people bury in the area that they're from. So it is very unlikely that you're going to find somebody who's from King Garden Bay asking to be buried in Seacoast Bay.
But do you make that request? Does the family member or the person who requests the permission to bury, they make that request, or the government says, well, okay, since you're from East End, you will be buried in the Greenland Cemetery?
No, the farm is there, and on the farm it asks which cemetery you'd like to be buried, and you ask about other information on the farm, basically date of death, place of death, birth, date of birth. And also we have one application form that covers all of the services that we provide. So the same application form for burials in a cemetery, whether public or private, also has, you need to indicate whether you're going to be buried above an existing grave, whether it will be burial at sea, whether it's an importation or whether it's an exportation. It's the same form basically that has all the information, and you just check the appropriate boxes.
Okay, we're going to get to some of the description of those various types of burial. Okay. You got some assistance from an official that called and said that family members can request an autopsy.
Okay.
So that persons know how that process takes place. So you go through the application, and what other procedures do you need now to bury the person. Well, in terms of getting the grave, preparation for the grave, and all those kind of things.
In the approval letter that we issue to persons, we have the specifications for the graves in terms of the size, the type of steel, with the dimensions, if it's above, because currently we allow up to three layers of burials in public burial grounds. So we have a drawing that we give to persons with the specifications so that they can see the way it is supposed to be constructed. I might add here that not every person constructs the vaults or the tombs in the way they should be constructed, and that brings me to a point of discussion, because we have had concerns expressed by members of the public that at some point maybe the government should consider identifying certain contractors or making it possible for certain contractors to be the ones to construct the vaults, because as you visit different burial grounds, you will see that while we allow 3 layers, the first one should really be underneath the earth, but you would find that in some burial grounds the first one is above, and that should not be.
But I'd like to make a suggestion, if I may, to weigh in on that particular issue, that it might get pushed back if the government is going to decide what contractor I'm going to choose to build my vault, right? But what I think the government may do is have inspectors to make sure that when the vault is completed, it has been completed with specifications. So that might be a way to go, because I don't want you telling me who to get to build my vault.
Right, because there are some persons who are known contractors who we can screw people, because there are some people who don't know, so they will ask, do you know anybody in this particular area who does vaults and stuff? So you direct, because we're not responsible for trying to get anybody any business, but we would direct people. But most times people know there are persons who they can turn to.
But you need to inspect the procedures generally up to the gravesite to make sure that the procedures, that the law is being followed. I think you have to have inspectors, because as a matter of fact I was getting ready to raise that question. Are you going to have inspectors to make sure that the policies and the new regulations are going to be, and the specifications and the new regulations going to be adhered to?
Well, the burial ground managers are supposed to have oversight of the burial grounds. The challenge there is that we have been working, the ministry has been working, because the law requires that all burial grounds should actually be fenced. But before we start telling the private burial ground owners that you need to comply with the law, the government first needs to comply with the law itself. So the ministry has been embarking on a project over the past couple of years where we have started to make sure that all of the public burial grounds are fenced. And not only fenced, but they're also supposed to have a proper gate. And some of them have a gate, a big gate, and then some of them have the pedestrian gate, which basically people can enter throughout the day if they want to visit their loved ones. What has happened in a number of cases, some of the burial grounds do not have a gate. So a number of times, which should not be happening, but people would go and start the construction and then come to us afterwards. So sometimes you would hear a notice on the radio that a person is being buried, John Doe is being buried, Saturday is the funeral. Okay, then we start asking around in the office, have you seen an application for this person? No. But
and what you do in that case? Do you call the family and say you can't go in Greenland because
a couple times we've called people and say, okay, I've heard an announcement, but if you know the person, but I haven't seen any application. Oh, I was supposed to come and bring it in. So we are hoping now, because of the fact that you're supposed to pay before you get in there, we are hoping that people will come, because the law, there are provisions in the law, but it's on summary conviction. By the time you get to that, the case has been called, the person has been buried.
Well, it seems to me that this regulation is going to require an enforcement team. It's like our legislation, you know, you need persons to enforce it. are you going to be hiring additional persons to make sure that these new policies and specifications and regulations are adhered to? That's the question.
Well, we are hoping that once we get the fencing in place and that the burial ground managers will continue to be our eyes and ears in the community.
So you'll come to the cemetery on Saturday to bury your loved one and find the gate locked because you had not made the correct provisions.
Right. But hopefully it wouldn't get to that bad. We've had cases where they've got, but actually to what is supposed to happen, because the pastors are supposed to ask for the permission to bury letter. Because if you don't have that, then it means that you don't have permission. Okay. And also the funeral homes would basically not bury you until they have that clearance.
Okay, so there's a level of professionalism in the procedure that will take place that will protect the families from making those mistakes. If they deal with a reputable funeral home. Okay. Now, what's the relationship between the private cemeteries and the government? How does the government interact with a person who has a family that has a private cemetery? And just so information purposes, can you just briefly describe what a private cemetery means?
Well, based on the law, a private cemetery is a cemetery that is not a public cemetery. That's what the law says. So church cemeteries will be considered a category of a private cemetery because they're not a public cemetery.
Okay. And a private cemetery would be a piece of land an individual has set aside for the burial of his family members.
Right. And in years gone by, there were a number of burial grounds throughout the territory, private burial grounds. Over the years, some of them the government has had to close some of them because of location. And the ladders give the government the permission to close cemeteries that are because of maybe in the best interest of the public. But
especially at night when you pass in the longer road by the cemetery, you feel the jumping and come out. That's just a joke. When I was a little boy, right. we were afraid of it.
But the private cemeteries, basically, we do have. I should add here that the law requires that private cemeteries be licensed.
Okay.
There is a procedure. You are supposed to apply to the ministry, to the Minister for Health, Social Development. Then, if a person applies, the minister is supposed to cause a notice to be placed in, I think it's 3 consecutive issues of a newspaper, so that if anybody has any objection, they can raise that. And then an inspection team from the ministry, environmental health, tongue and country planning will go visit the site, check about its suitability for a private cemetery, and then we move on. But we haven't had too many applications for new cemeteries within the past couple of years. But some person again have expressed concern. Does the government need to continue to grant permission for people to have private cemeteries, considering the fact that we have so many of them around, and also because of the fact that a number of them are not being properly maintained? But we have quite a number of cemeteries, but the procedure is the same. They apply, but the fee doesn't apply to them because the law only speaks to fees for public burial grounds. Okay. It doesn't speak to anything for private.
So in essence, you can no longer, or a person can no longer decide for themselves where they want to put a plot to bury their loved ones.
Right.
The application has to be made to the government.
Yes.
And that whole process that you just outlined has to take place so that you can get approval.
Right.
To put a cemetery.
Right. That's correct.
And if you have a private cemetery, you don't have to pay fees, but you still have to go through the regular burial process.
Right, so that the ministry is aware of the number of burials that are taking place. There are some jurisdictions actually that require private cemeteries to give reports to government, for example, so that you would know how many more spaces you have left, so that when an application comes in, you can say, okay, the Johnson family, for example, still has X number of spaces. And private burial grounds also are supposed to have burial ground managers. So when we issue letters for permission to grant when we issue letters of permission to bury in private burial grounds, we also touch base with the private burial ground managers to make sure that it's okay, because we don't want that Cromwell comes in and says, I'm going to bury in a Smith burial ground, and then the manager for that cemetery said, Cromwell and I didn't get along, I don't want to bury here. So we have to make sure that we touch base with the burial ground managers.
So the private burial ground have to have a burial ground manager?
Yes.
Okay. To avoid family confusion.
Yeah, but so that we will also have a point so that when we issue a letter, they have a copy of it as well, because family, as a matter of fact, recently I think we had a question where a private somebody from a private burial ground came and asked us for some of our records to check and see who was buried there, because sometimes their records might not be up to date either. But if they come to us, we must have our records that we can say, yes, you've had over three burials over the past 3 years, and these are who the persons were.
Now, are the burial grounds going to be required to have a certain layout? I mean, how it's supposed to look, the lineup of the graves, the distance between each grave, that sort of thing. The
law specifies the size, I think it's 9 by 4, and I think there's supposed to be at least 3 feet between each grave.
So the width of the grave is 4
and the length
feet.
Is 9.
And the length is 9 feet.
Yes.
And you have 3 feet between.
It's supposed to be 3 feet in between, and I think the law also says they should be parallel. So basically, they should be laid out in a certain way within the burial grounds.
Okay. So the bodies will be in a line.
Yes. That's the way they're supposed to be.
And then it's 3 feet all around.
Yes.
Okay.
3 feet in between. Yes.
Yeah. So 3 feet at the foot, 3 feet at the head, 3 feet on each side.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to take a break and we're going to continue the discussion. And I'm going to open up the phone lines when we come back so persons can call and ask questions as well. So keep it locked right here at the Spotlight. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors.
This program is sponsored by the law firm of J.S. Archibald & Co. and by the trust company J.S. Archibald Trust Services Limited, both of Rotown, Tortola, BVI.